It's really interesting looking back at the development of The Irishman and seeing how the project changed over time. I know it sounds crazy, what with the movie now being a $200 million special effects extravaganza, but one of the reasons people were originally excited for the film was because it was thought that The Irishman would see Scorsese return to small-scale filmmaking, away from the blockbusters like Shutter Island and The Departed. The latter, funnily enough, had a similar development to The Irishman. The Departed was originally supposed to be a small-scale and experimental film, but as more and more A-listers joined the cast, the project got more expensive and the scale got bigger and bigger. With The Irishman, many Scorsese fans predicted an introspective chamber piece, a low-budget following of two elderly gangsters on a car trip looking back on the regrets of their lives having turned to religion after lives full of sins. The premise would make a fitting swan song to Scorsese's career, seeing as though the film that shot him to stardom was Mean Streets, a movie about a small-time hood trying to make his way on the streets. This film also had religious and existential themes, and as I mentioned in another video, do we need another Martin Scorsese gangster movie? The four Italian-American mafia movies that Scorsese has made, Mean Streets, Goodfellas, Casino and The Irishman, seemingly follow a developing movement, having the first movie focused on deadbeats, then next on middle-of-the-park thugs, the third exploring gangsters at the very top of the food chain controlling entire cities, and this new movie which will examine them in their old age, past their prime and full of reflection. The Irishman was announced sometime after the completion of Shutter Island. Robert De Niro had approached Scorsese about a book he wanted adapted, I Heard You Paint Houses, and he wanted to play the main character Frank Sheeran, with the novel exploring his mafia connections and his links to the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. Paramount was set to make the picture, and the Scorsese-Paramount combo has given us films like The Wolf of Wall Street, Hugo and the already mentioned Shutter Island. In 2010, De Niro sat down for an interview and made some interesting comments about the film. He said, "We have a more ambitious idea, hopefully, to make it a two-part type of film or two films. It's an idea that came about from Eric Roth to combine these movies using the footage from Paint Houses and do another kind of film that is reminiscent of a kind of 8½, La Dolce Vita, a kind of biographical, semi-biographical type of Hollywood movie, a director and the actor, based on things Marty and I have experienced and kind of overlapping them." So it sounds as if after filming the relatively straightforward The Irishman, it would be followed up by a kind of meta-movie which would reference the filmographies of Scorsese and De Niro's careers, perhaps weaving a fictional story with the meta-elements. The script for The Irishman had already been written by this point, and the meta-textual companion piece was supposed to be penned by Eric Roth. However, later that year, De Niro expressed doubts over the second movie being made, but did share some incredible news on The Irishman, that Joe Pesci and Al Pacino would also be in it, all directed under Scorsese, a mafia movie fan's dream. About a year later, though it was never confirmed, and the actor himself said he hadn't been contacted about the movie, Harvey Keitel was also rumoured to have been given a role, and of course now we know that he is in the film. Fans waited and waited for the movie, but despite Scorsese saying in 2011 that he hoped to get the movie made in the next year or so, it just never came. Scorsese made film after film, and some projects like The Snowman and Sinatra he would try to get off the ground but eventually leave, and The Irishman would occasionally come up in an interview with De Niro saying it was all being planned very seriously, but that was it. It was as if De Niro was trolling everyone. Where was this film that everyone was waiting for? Why were they waiting so long, with the cast getting older and older? But then, after Scorsese finished The Wolf of Wall Street, he had only two potential projects lined up, Silence and The Irishman. Silence had been finally cleared of a decade-long legal issue, which meant the film could finally be made, and Scorsese promised Silence is next, given that this was his personal passion project. And then The Irishman. Paramount were no doubt looking forward to the money and the awards The Irishman would garner, and thus reluctantly distributed Scorsese's passion project Silence whilst they waited for The Irishman. But then, after a huge wait for Silence to be completed, which took several years, disaster for the studio. Silence flopped, earning around $7 million worldwide on a $50 million budget in what was already a difficult year for Paramount. Resignations happened, and it was looking increasingly like the Hollywood giants were heading for bankruptcy. As a result, they said they would be unable to take a risk on The Irishman. It's strange that they would consider a gangster movie directed by Scorsese with all these legendary stars a risk, but we didn't know yet just how expensive this movie was looking to be. At the very least, Fans of Scorsese were excited that finally, after all these years, they are actively trying to make the film, even though it was looking difficult. Mexican producer Gaston Pavlovich, who had helped finance Scorsese's silence, was looking to fund the entire thing, but escalating costs meant he was unable to, though he did stay on as producer. After Paramount's departure, Scorsese and De Niro auctioned off the production and distribution rights to a company called SDX, an up-and-coming company, which was a surprise to most. They got the project for $50 million, and the film itself was budgeted for a whopping $100 million due to Scorsese making the decision to controversially digitally de-age actors to make them look younger and more appropriate for the time period their characters were in, as the movie would go back and forward in time. It was a huge jump from what was originally conceived as a modestly budgeted film, but at least it was finally being made. It was being made, but it was being made without Pesci, who for some reason dropped out of the film. To the horror of film fans everywhere, Pesci was constantly turning down Scorsese's efforts to get him to sign on to the project. It looked like they would have to move on from Pesci until a few months before the actual filming of The Irishman. It was confirmed that yes, Pesci was going to be in the movie, having finally signed on, and everyone waiting for the film breathed a sigh of relief. It all seemed like the movie was being groomed for production to start within a few months of SDX's acquisition in around late 2016 or early 2017, but then another hurdle came up. As it turns out, the original projected costs of the film were either wrong or out of date, as the movie would now cost $150 million, an amount SDX were unable to provide. Since this news, the budget has risen even further, incredibly, meaning this movie is now the most expensive film Scorsese has ever made. Scorsese and co. then went about finding the extra funds, and it's telling that they couldn't get any of the big Hollywood studios to come forward and take on the project. Instead, streaming service Netflix came in and took over the film from SDX, who still retained some foreign distribution rights. Netflix acquiring the movie brings up all sorts of new questions, like is the movie even going to play in cinemas? Either way, the film was finally on the move and a stellar cast had signed on, including Al Pacino, Anne Paquin, Jesse Plemons, Bobby Cannavale, Stephen Graham, Harvey Keitel, Ray Romano, and Catherine Narducci. Then, after all this time, in September 2017, The Irishman began filming, and eventually ending up as the longest shooting schedule of Scorsese's career, wrapping half a year later in March 2018. The film is currently in post-production, where it will probably remain for a while given the de-aging effects need to be applied, and Scorsese usually takes a long time editing anyway. It's set to be released in late 2019, over 10 years after it was first announced, with perhaps being given a limited Oscar run in order to be eligible for Academy Awards, but you'd think Netflix would use their streaming service as the primary output. It's controversial that the film is being released on Netflix, especially for a cinephile like Scorsese, a true lover of cinema. What does it say about the modern state of Hollywood when a movie directed by Scorsese starring Robert De Niro and Al Pacino and Joe Pesci can't get a cinema studio to finance it, and it ends up on a streaming service like Netflix? Anyway, it's truly remarkable following the development of the film, where this small-scale chamber piece became a weird two-part meta-movie, and after many obstacles ended up as a $200 million special effects heavy epic. Here's hoping the film lives up to the incredible hype it's generating, and does justice to the prestige of the cast, the crew, and the efforts of all those involved in making the film. Thanks for watching.